July 7, 1973. Two men on bicycles. A ditch beside Back Bay Drive, Newport Beach, California. What they found stopped them cold. An 11-year-old girl, still wearing the white dress with light blue flowers her mother had sewn for her. She had been strangled, sexually assaulted, and left in the weeds like she was nothing. The last person to see Linda and O'Keefe alive described a man. A van, turquoise. She had been talking to him at an intersection just the afternoon before. By the time anyone thought to look for her, the van was gone. The man was gone. And for the next 4 to 6 years. So was every answer. To understand what happened to Linda O'Keefe, you have to start where she started, on a perfectly ordinary summer morning in one of the most beautiful beach towns in California. Newport Beach in 1973 was a kind of place where parents didn't worry. The kind of place where kids walked home from school alone because that's just what kids did. The streets were quiet, the days were long, and the community was small enough that people knew their neighbors. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. She lived in Corona Del Mar, a neighborhood within Newport Beach, with her family. By all accounts, she was a normal kid. She went to summer school at Lincoln Intermediate School. She had a sister named Cindy. She had a mother who loved her enough to make her clothes by hand. On the morning of July 6, 1973, she put on a white dress with light blue flowers, a dress her mother had sewn, and she walked to summer school. She would never come home. Here's what we know about Linda's last afternoon, based on the Newport Beach Police Department's reconstruction of events, a reconstruction they would spend the next 4.5 decades refining, correcting, and revisiting. Around 1:30 in the afternoon, summer school let out. Linda began walking home. The route was familiar. The neighborhood was safe. There was nothing about that day that should have ended the way it did. At some point near the intersection of Marguerite Drive and Inlet Drive, just a short walk from school, a witness spotted Linda. She was standing near a van, talking to someone. A man. The van was described as turquoise, or possibly blue. Accounts vary slightly on the exact shade, which matters more than it might seem, and we'll come back to that. The witness didn't think much of it. A kid talking to an adult near a van. Nothing alarming. This was 1973. This was Newport Beach. But that was the last confirmed sighting of Linda O'Keefe alive. She didn't come home for dinner. Her family started to worry. By evening, she was reported missing. Police began looking. They would find her the next morning, but not in the way anyone hoped. Back Bay Drive runs along the edge of the upper Newport Bay, a nature reserve that sits just a few miles from where Linda was last seen. It's a beautiful stretch of land, actually. Marshland, egrets. Joggers now use it. Cyclists. On the morning of July 7, 1973, two men on bikes were riding along that path when they found her. Linda O'Keefe. In a ditch. In the weeds off the side of the road. She had been strangled. She had been sexually assaulted. And she was still wearing the dress her mother made her. That last detail has stayed with people who've covered this case for decades. There's something about it, the dress, handmade, still on her, that makes the violence of what happened feel almost unbearable. She was somebody's daughter, somebody's little girl, and someone had done this to her, and then just left her there. Newport Beach police responded immediately. A homicide investigation was opened. And here's where the case both comes together and starts to fall apart. The medical examiner confirmed the cause of death, strangulation. The sexual assault was confirmed as well. Evidence was collected from the victim's body, including a biological sample that, had the technology existed at the time, might have solved this case within weeks. But this was 1973. DNA profiling as we know it didn't exist yet. The science that would eventually bring Linda's killer to justice was still 15 years away from being invented, and another 30 years beyond that from being applied the way it ultimately would be. So investigators worked with what they had. They canvassed the neighborhood. They took statements. They followed leads. The witness who'd seen Linda near the turquoise van gave a description of the man, but descriptions from a brief, distant sighting in 1973 are what they are. Vague. Incomplete. Enough to know something, not enough to find anyone. The van was never found. The man was never identified. And after months of investigation that turned up no viable suspect, the case went cold. Here's something that doesn't get said enough about cold cases. The people who work them don't forget. Inside the Newport Beach Police Department's Detective Division, for the next 4 to 6 years, there was a photograph of Linda and O'Keefe on the wall. Not filed away. Not digitized into a folder. On the wall, where every detective who walked in every day could see her. It's a small thing. But it's not a small thing. It means that generations of investigators, officers who weren't even born when Linda was murdered, grew up professionally in the shadow of this case. It was institutional memory made physical, a reminder that the job wasn't finished. Multiple detectives over the decades took on the O'Keefe case as something close to a personal mission. They re-examined evidence. They re-interviewed anyone they could find. They submitted the biological sample collected from Linda's body to the National DNA Database, CODIS, in 2001, nearly 30 years after the murder. No match. The database searched. It compared. It found nothing. And that's where things stood for another 17 years. Which raises a question that we need to sit with for a moment, because it becomes very important later. If his DNA was in the system, why didn't it hit? We'll get to that. But hold that thought. While Newport Beach investigators were chasing a ghost, let's talk about who that ghost actually was. Because James Allen Neal's life before July 6, 1973 is one of the most important parts of this story, and it's a part that almost nobody covered at the time. James Albert Layton Jr. was born on July 28, 1946, in Chicago, Illinois. He was the middle of 3 children. His family later relocated to California. He was about 10 years old when they moved, landing in Southern California sometime around 1956. By almost every account from parole records and prosecutor statements, his upbringing was brutal. His parents were described as physically and psychologically abusive, to him and to his siblings. He had a documented inability to form meaningful relationships with anyone. Family, employers, anyone. He started breaking into homes around age 12 years old. By the time he dropped out of school in 1963, he already had a juvenile record. He worked odd jobs, cook, factory worker, floral delivery, but couldn't hold anything down. He drifted. He accumulated charges. He went in and out of correctional facilities. Here's the timeline that matters most. James Albert Layton Jr. was paroled on July 14, 1971, 2 years and 22 days before Linda O'Keefe disappeared. He was working as a construction worker in the Newport Beach area in the summer of 1973. That's confirmed by prosecutors. He was local. He knew the streets. And on July 6, 1973, based on the evidence that would eventually emerge nearly half a century later, he was driving a turquoise van near Marguerite Drive and Inlet Drive at around 1:30 in the afternoon. Think about that. He had been out of prison for less than 2 years. He was already on parole. He had a record that stretched back to his childhood. And somehow, he was never, in 1973, connected to this crime. Not then. Not for a long time. After July 6, 1973, James Albert Layton Jr. left California. Records show he was arrested in Florida in September 1973, just 2 months after Linda's murder. Then arrested again in Denver in 1974 on a parole violation. He was placed back on parole in 1975. His original sentence officially ended in 1977. But somewhere in that window, somewhere between California and Florida, something happened. Something serious enough that he legally changed his name. James Albert Layton Jr. erased himself and became James Allen Neal. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer confirmed this publicly in 2019. He confirmed there was a criminal incident in Florida that precipitated the name change. He did not elaborate on what that incident was. The specific details have never been made public. Let's be clear about what this means in practice. In 1973, there was no national computerized criminal database the way we think of today. Law enforcement agencies in different states didn't automatically share information. If you committed a crime in California, moved to Florida, and changed your name, you could, with some effort, functionally disappear from the record. Not completely. Not forever. But enough. James Allen Neal registered to vote in Colorado. He built a life. He had parole officers who noted he couldn't connect with people, but he was out. He was free. He was no longer James Layton. He was Neal. And Neal had no direct connection, on paper, to a murdered girl in Newport Beach. Except for one thing. One thing he couldn't erase, change, or move away from. His biology. This is the part of the story that should make you genuinely angry. While Newport Beach detectives kept Linda's photo on their wall, while her family lived without answers, while investigators dead-ended into cold lead after cold lead, James Allen Neal was not living quietly in the shadows, keeping his head down, hoping no one ever looked too closely. He kept offending. Prosecutors confirmed in 2019 that identifying Neal as Linda O'Keefe's alleged killer led them directly to 2 additional victims, both children, in Riverside County, California. Charges were filed in connection with lewd and lascivious acts against a child committed between July 1995 and July 2000, and against a second child between March 2002 and March 2004. These were not ancient history. These were ongoing crimes. Active crimes. Crimes committed decades after Linda's murder, in the same state, by a man living under a different name. He was 60 years old when the last of those alleged Riverside County offenses occurred. 60 years old. And still at it. The criminal complaint in the Riverside cases was sealed by the court, so we don't have complete details. What we do know is that 2 more children were allegedly harmed. 2 more families were affected. And because his name had changed and no one had connected the dots, it took until 2019, when his DNA unlocked the O'Keefe case, for those charges to surface at all. James Allen Neal spent the better part of 5 decades as a predator who the system simply could not find, partly because of its own limitations, partly because he was deliberately hiding, and partly because the science to catch him didn't exist yet. Until it did. On July 6, 2018, exactly 45 years to the day after Linda O'Keefe disappeared, the Newport Beach Police Department did something unusual. They logged onto Twitter, and they started posting as Linda. The opening tweet read, "Hi, I'm Linda O'Keefe, or Linda A.N.N. O'Keefe, if I'm in trouble with my mom. 4 to 5 years ago today, I disappeared from Newport Beach. I was murdered. My body was found in the Back Bay. My killer was never found." Over the course of that day, using the hashtag #LindaStory, the department posted a series of tweets reconstructing Linda's final hours from her own point of view. Her morning, her outfit, her walk home, the intersection, the man, the van. It was unconventional. It was emotional. And it worked. The campaign reached millions of people. It generated enormous media attention. Linda's story, a cold case that had gone mostly unnoticed outside of Newport Beach for 4.5 decades, was suddenly national news. But here's the thing, and this is important. The Twitter campaign was not what solved the case. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis said as much in 2019. The arrest, he said, was due to what he called the latest in DNA technology. The social media campaign got attention. It may have kept the case alive in the public consciousness. But the breakthrough came from somewhere else entirely. It came from science. To understand how James Allen Neal was finally identified, you need to understand 2 things that happened to forensic science between 1973 and 2018. The first was CODIS, the Combined DNA Index System, the national DNA database maintained by the FBI. When investigators submitted the biological evidence from Linda's case to CODIS in 2001, they were hoping for a direct match, someone whose DNA was already in the system. There was no match, meaning Neal's DNA, under whatever name, wasn't in CODIS at that time in a way that flagged him. The second development was genetic genealogy. And this is where things get genuinely remarkable. Genetic genealogy works like this. You take an unknown DNA profile from a crime scene, and you upload it to a consumer genealogy database. The kind of database where ordinary people upload their own DNA to find distant relatives, trace their family trees, learn where their ancestors came from. When the crime scene DNA is compared against those millions of voluntary submissions, you're not looking for a direct match. You're looking for partial matches, relatives, cousins, siblings, people who share enough genetic material with the unknown subject to help investigators build a family tree backward toward the suspect. It's painstaking. It requires a genealogist with serious skill. But it works. Newport Beach investigators worked with Parabon Nanolabs, a Virginia-based DNA phenotyping company that has worked on the majority of cold cases cracked through this method. Their chief genetic genealogist, CEC Moore, has become one of the most important figures in cold case investigation in the last decade. The team also used Parabon Snapshot Service to generate a DNA phenotype, essentially a computer-generated portrait of what the suspect might have looked like based on genetic markers. They produced two images, what the killer probably looked like in 1973 and what he might look like today. The genealogy search ran. In January 2019, just weeks before the arrest, it returned a result. Not a direct match. A pointer. A family connection that led investigators toward a name. That name, once pulled, led them to James Allen Neal in Colorado Springs, Colorado. But they couldn't arrest him on a genealogy match alone. They needed his DNA, so they put him under surveillance. They waited. And at some point, the exact method has never been publicly disclosed, they obtained a sample. Legally, covertly, without him knowing. The lab ran the comparison. It matched. 4 to 6 years of silence, and it matched. On February 19, 2019, at approximately 6:30 in the morning, Newport Beach detectives and local law enforcement moved on a house in Colorado Springs, Colorado. James Allen Neal, born James Albert Layton Jr., Chicago, Illinois, July 28, 1946, was taken into custody without incident. He was 72 years old. The Newport Beach Police Department announced his arrest the following day, February 20, 2019. The announcement came in the form of a tweet, fitting, given how the department had used social media to keep the case alive. It read, in the voice they'd used before, on Tuesday, February 19, 2019, detective from the NBPD arrested this man, James Allen Neal, in Colorado Springs, CO for murder. My murder. Orange County District Attorney Todd Spitzer held a press conference. He announced the charges, murder while in the commission of lewd acts on a child under 14. 5 felony counts of lewd acts on a child under 14. A sentencing enhancement for multiple victims. Maximum sentence, 82 years to life in state prison. Now here's something worth pausing on, because it tells you something about how long this case had been running. Todd Spitzer, the DA who announced this arrest, was 12 years old when Linda O'Keefe was murdered. He was 1 year older than her. He grew up in the same era, in the same region. And 50 years later, he was the one standing at a podium announcing that her killer had finally been found. The investigation had literally outlasted generations. Spitzer said he looked into the possibility of pursuing the death penalty for Neal. Legal research, he said, showed it was not an option. Neal was charged with what the evidence and the law allowed, and he would face trial. That was the plan. Let's talk about who James Allen Neal actually was, not just the charges, but the man behind them. Because his history is not a mystery. It's documented. And it paints a very specific picture. He was a chronic, lifelong offender whose criminal record began at approximately 12 years of age. He was described in parole reports as someone fundamentally unable to connect with other people. His parents were abusive. His early life was chaotic. He dropped out of school, drifted between jobs, accumulated convictions. He was paroled 2 years before Linda's murder and was working construction in the Newport Beach area at the time. After 1973, he fled the state, changed his name, resurfaced in Colorado, and according to prosecutors, continued to offend against children for at least another 3 decades. The Parabon DNA phenotype rendering that investigators released alongside his actual driver's license photo became one of the most striking images of this case's resolution. The computer-generated portrait, built entirely from crime scene DNA, bore a recognizable resemblance to the real man. The jawline, the general features. It wasn't exact. Phenotyping is predictive, not photographic, but it was close enough to be genuinely unsettling. It meant the DNA from that 1973 crime scene hadn't just survived. It had described him. When Neal was arrested for Linda's murder, the investigation didn't stop there. Identifying him as the suspect in the O'Keefe case opened a door that led directly to 2 additional victims in Riverside County, California. The charges, 5 counts of lewd acts on children under 14, related to 2 Jane Does. The criminal complaint, filed in March 2019, described offenses occurring between 1995 and 2004. The complaint was sealed by the court, meaning the identities of the victims and the full details of what was alleged remain confidential. What we know, 2 children. Different years. Same man. Senior Deputy District Attorney Matt Murphy confirmed the Riverside countercharges were not cold cases, meaning they came to light as a result of Neal's arrest in 2019, suggesting these victims, or people who knew them, came forward after his identification. That's worth sitting with for a moment. It's possible, we cannot confirm this, but it is possible, that there were people who knew something about what Neal had done to children in Riverside County, and who never came forward until they saw his name and face connected to the murder of Linda O'Keefe. We don't know what the Riverside victims experienced when they heard about the arrest. We don't know what it meant for them to finally have a name, a face, a confirmed identity attached to what had been done to them. We only know they existed, that they mattered, and that the case that began with Linda ultimately surfaced them. On March 11, 2019, James Allen Neal was extradited from Colorado and booked into Orange County Jail. He was arraigned on March 29, 2019, and he pleaded not guilty. Not guilty. To all of it. The murder. The Riverside County charges. Everything. He faced up to 82 years to life in prison. Pre-trial hearings were scheduled. The wheels of the justice system began to turn, slowly, as they do. And then, in the spring of 2020, they stopped. On May 25, 2020, James Allen Neal was taken from Orange County Jail to an area hospital. An undisclosed illness. He was 73 years old by this point. At approximately 5:15 in the morning on July 22, 2020, he was pronounced dead. No symptoms of COVID-19, officials confirmed. The illness was not specified. He was gone. And with him went everything he knew. Everything he had never said. Every answer Linda's family had spent 47 years waiting to hear. Newport Beach Police Chief John Lewis issued a statement. It said, "It was our intention to see James Allen Neal stand trial and answer for the murder of Linda and O'Keefe. Linda's story deeply touched the hearts of our community. Through the tireless efforts of generations of our investigators, we hope we have been able to bring a measure of closure to Linda's family, friends, and loved ones." Todd Spitzer, the DA who had been 12 years old when Linda died, said this, "The pursuit of justice is never-ending, and in this case the hunt for a child rapist and murderer lasted more than 46 years and transcended generations of law enforcement officers. There was no trial, no testimony, no verdict, no closure." Linda's sister Cindy Borgeson was alive to see the arrest in 2019. She told reporters at the time that she never really thought they would actually find her sister's killer. Never thought that day would come. She said, "My hope is that it brings hope to other families that haven't had a resolve yet." There's something quietly devastating about that statement. She found out her sister's alleged killer had been caught, and her first thought was about other families. Other people still waiting. She had waited 4 to 6 years. And the answer, when it finally came, lasted less than 18 months before the man died in custody and the trial evaporated. What does that feel like? We can only imagine. And we probably shouldn't try. Here's what we know, confirmed, beyond reasonable doubt. Linda and O'Keefe was abducted near the intersection of Marguerite Drive and Inlet Drive in Newport Beach, California, on July 6, 1973, at approximately 1:30 in the afternoon. Her body was found on July 7, 1973, in a ditch alongside Back Bay Drive. She had been strangled. She had been sexually assaulted. Biological evidence was collected at the scene and preserved. James Allen Neal, born James Albert Layton Jr., was a construction worker living in the Newport Beach area at the time of the murder. He had a prior criminal record stretching back to childhood. He had been paroled 2 years before the crime. DNA from the 1973 crime scene was matched to Neal through genetic genealogy, via family tree DNA and the work of Parabon Nanolabs. In January 2019, a surveillance operation confirmed the match against a fresh sample obtained from Neal without his knowledge. He was arrested on February 19, 2019, charged with murder, kidnapping, and lewd and lascivious acts on a minor. He pleaded not guilty. He died in custody on July 22, 2020, before trial. Here's what we don't know. We don't know exactly what happened in that turquoise van. We don't know how long Linda was held before she was killed. We don't know whether she fought back, whether she called out, whether she understood what was happening to her. Those details, if they were ever known, were buried with James Allen Neal. We don't know what happened in Florida. The criminal incident that caused him to legally change his name has never been identified or publicly disclosed. Were there other victims? Were there other cases? No one has said. No one may ever say. We don't know whether the Riverside County victims received any sense of resolution from his death. Their cases will remain sealed. Their names will remain protected. Their experiences remain their own. And we don't know, because he never told anyone, whether James Allen Neal understood, across those 4 to 6 years, that the evidence was out there, that it was preserved, that eventually, inevitably, the science would catch up. Did he think he was safe? Did he ever lose sleep over it? We'll never know. The Linda O'Keefe case is talked about now, primarily, as a landmark in forensic genealogy. And that's fair. It was one of the early, high-profile demonstrations that genetic genealogy could crack cases that had been stone cold for decades. Since April 2018, just months before the Newport Beach Police Department launched Linda's story, genetic genealogy had already helped identify more than 36 suspects in cold cases across the country. The Golden State Killer, Joseph DeAngelo, had been identified through the same general method just months before. The technique was young, powerful, and spreading fast. Linda's case became part of that wave, a proof of concept, a demonstration that DNA preserved from 1973 could, in 2019, point to a specific human being living under a different name in a different state. But there's another way to read this case that has nothing to do with technology. A photograph stayed on a wall for 4 to 6 years. Not in a file. Not in a database. On a wall where people could see it. Where detectives who were children when Linda died could look at her every single day and be reminded that the job wasn't finished. That's not a technology story. That's a human one. And then there's this. The genealogy database that ultimately cracked the case was built by ordinary people. People who uploaded their own DNA to find their grandparents' birthplaces. People who wanted to know their ethnic heritage. People who had no idea that their voluntary submission would one day reach backward through 50 years of silence and touch the hand of a murdered 11-year-old girl. If you've ever submitted your DNA to a genealogy site, to 23andMe, to Ancestry, to Family Tree DNA, you are, in a way, part of that system. You may not know it. You almost certainly didn't think about it when you swabbed your cheek. But your DNA doesn't just trace your family backward. It reaches laterally, to cousins you've never met, to relatives you don't know exist. And sometimes, it reaches toward justice. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. She was walking home from summer school in a white dress with light blue flowers. She had a sister named Cindy. She had a mother who sewed her clothes. She deserved to make it home. She deserved a trial. Her family deserved a verdict. The truth deserved a public record. Instead, they got DNA. They got a name. They got an arrest, and a plea of not guilty, and a man who died in a jail cell before anyone could ask him a single question under oath. Is that justice? I honestly don't know. But I know her name. And I know it because people refuse to let it be forgotten. Linda O'Keefe. Corona Del Mar, California. July 6, 1973. Say her name. James Allen Neal died in custody on July 22, 2020. He was never convicted of any crime related to Linda O'Keefe's murder. His plea of not guilty stands as the official court record. The Riverside County charges involving 2 additional child victims were also dismissed upon his death. Linda O'Keefe was 11 years old. If you have any information related to this case or any cold case in your community, contact your local law enforcement or the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children at 1-800-843-5678. If this video meant something to you, share it, subscribe, and leave a comment below telling me which part of this story hit hardest. Because these cases don't stay alive by accident. They stay alive because people refuse to look away. See you next time.